June 5, 1942. Flagship Yamato. Combined Fleet Command Spaces. Somewhere in the cold gray North Pacific west of Midway, the steel deck is alive with vibration. A steady pulse that creeps up through boots and into bones. The air below is thick with oil, sweat, and damp paper. In the dim light of red-shaded lamps, map tables glow like altars. Pins and strings mark the operation that was supposed to finish the Americans in one clean, decisive cut. Then the radio room begins to feed the chart room a different kind of map. A young communications officer steps in fast, too fast for a ship that prides itself on controlled movement. He bows, but his bow is shallow, his face tight as if he has bitten down on a scream. The message packet in his hands is already smudged, gripped too hard. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto does not rise. He does not have to. The room rises around him. Staff officers lean forward. A pencil stops scratching mid-line. You can hear the faint rattle of a ventilation fan and, beyond that, the sea, striking the hull like slow applause for a tragedy. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, takes the paper first. Ugaki is a man of clipped habits and clipped sentences. He reads. His eyes flick once to the wall clock, then back to the page, as if time itself has betrayed them. The first reports are incomplete, jagged, full of gaps where ships should be. Akagi struck, burning. Kaga struck, burning. Soryu struck, burning. Hiryu fighting, then silence. Each line is a knife laid carefully on the table. Someone whispers the obvious, the forbidden thought in any navy that worships the offensive spirit. 4 carriers. 4, not damaged, not forced to withdraw, but gone in flame and water. Ugaki's jaw tightens. His voice, when it comes, is controlled but edged, not for the room, but for himself. A remark made the way a man might check the tightness of a bandage on a wound he cannot show. So this is what the Americans were waiting for. In another corner of the chart room, a staff officer begins to reach for explanations the way a drowning man reaches for air. Bad luck, poor visibility, a delayed launch, the enemy appearing at the wrong moment, the kind of rationalization that can be carried like a life raft. Yamamoto cuts through it with silence. He stares at the map. Midway is a small speck on the paper, a name that suddenly weighs as much as an empire. For months, Yamamoto has warned that Japan can sprint, but cannot endure a marathon against American industry. Now the sprint itself has broken an ankle. Ugaki finally looks up. The habit of command forces him to speak, to turn chaos into orders. But his words are not orders yet. If the mobile force is crippled, the operation is finished. Nobody argues. There is nothing to argue with. The plan was built on carrier air power, on striking first and striking again. Without it, the surface ships are blind fists swinging at shadows. Outside the room, the fleet continues to move, thousands of tons of steel obeying helm orders as if nothing has changed. That is the strangest part. The machinery still works, the discipline still holds, but the future has shifted. In the hours that follow, more messages arrive, and with each one the shape of the disaster sharpens. Reports of lost air crews, reports of fuel, of scattered destroyers, of a retreat that must be conducted with dignity. Even the language of the signals seems to flinch, softening the blow with formality, avoiding the words that would admit total ruin. Ugaki turns to Yamamoto, measuring every syllable. In the Navy's inner circle, there is no need to pretend. Midway is not a setback. It is not a lesson. It is a wound that will not close. And then, like a second battle opening behind the first, another decision presses in. What do we tell Tokyo? What do we tell the Emperor? What do we tell the nation? Because out there, beyond the bulkheads of the Yamato, beyond the charts and the pins, Japan is still drunk on victory. Posters still promise unstoppable advance. Newspapers still print heroic dispatches. Families still believe the fleet is invincible. Inside this room, the admirals understand something the public cannot be allowed to feel yet. Shock is contagious. So the first impulse is not only to regroup at sea, but to seal the truth on land. The defeat must be contained, boxed, classified, wrapped in ceremony and vague language, until the state can decide how much reality the people are permitted to survive. Ugaki folds the message papers carefully, as if neatness can restore what has burned. Yamamoto remains still, eyes on Midway's tiny mark. For the first time in the war, the combined fleet is not thinking about the next attack. It is thinking about how to explain a loss that cannot be reversed. June 6th, 1942. Yamato still rides the swell. But the command spaces have changed. The room smells sharper now, as if fear has its own odor. Coffee cups sit untouched. Cigarette smoke hangs in thin sheets, drifting toward the ventilation grills like prayers looking for a way out. Ugaki moves with a folder pressed to his chest. His handwriting has filled page after page, a private record of shame and calculation. He stops beside Yamamoto, lowers his voice, and delivers what no man wants to say on a flagship that represents certainty. The enemy did not win by chance. Yamamoto's eyes do not leave the chart. He speaks softly, almost clinically, as if he is describing a storm front. They found us at the moment our decks were weakest. The room understands the meaning. A carrier is not a battleship. A carrier is a living machine with fragile lungs. On the hangar decks, aircraft are fueled, bombs stacked, torpedoes rolled, and hoses snake across the planking. In that moment, one dive bomber can do what a whole battle line cannot. It can light the lungs on fire. Another signal arrives. More names. More dead. Hear you. The last to fight has been finished. For several breaths, nobody moves. Then Ugaki's voice hardens into the tone of a man forcing himself to remain an officer. We must withdraw the main body. There is nothing left to strike with. A staff captain begins to protest, not out of logic, but out of doctrine. The Navy has trained for decisive battle. The enemy must be annihilated. To turn away feels like treason against everything they have been taught. Yamamoto lifts a hand. The gesture is small, but it silences the room like a slammed door. If we stay, we will lose more than carriers. We will lose the fleet. Outside, the Yamato's turrets sit angled skyward, huge barrels that have never fired in anger at the enemy. The battleship was supposed to finish the Americans at close range. Now it is a cathedral of unused power, escorting a retreat. That word is never spoken aloud on the bridge. Retreat. Instead, they say redeploy, reposition, regroup. Language is armor. June 7th. A coded dispatch is prepared for Tokyo. It is careful, surgical, designed to inform without detonating panic. The casualties are listed in a way that sounds temporary, as if ships can be recovered once the sea calms. The tone is respectful to the imperial institution, respectful to the nation, but the men writing it can feel their hands tremble when the ink touches paper. Because once the message leaves Yamato, the disaster stops belonging to the fleet alone. It becomes political. The dispatch crosses a chain of listening stations and cipher offices, slipping through the night like a wounded animal. In Tokyo, the Navy Ministry and Naval General Staff receive fragments first. Officers in crisp uniforms read the lines under electric lamps, eyes flicking to each other, then away, as if the truth is contagious. 4 carriers, an entire generation of trained aviators, the spear point of Japan's offensive power. In a conference room that smells of floor polish and damp wool coats, senior officers gather. The men here are not on heaving decks. They are in chairs. They are surrounded by maps pinned to walls, by telephones that ring like alarms. and by the unspoken awareness that the Emperor must not hear bad news the wrong way, from the wrong mouth. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, is not a man who shouts. His authority is the weight of tradition and proximity to the throne. When he receives the full report, he reads it twice, then sets it down carefully as if it might explode. Somebody nearby murmurs, almost involuntarily, that the losses are unimaginable. Nagano's reply is quiet, the kind of quiet that makes everyone lean in. Unimaginable is not useful. We must decide what can be said. The room shifts from strategy to containment, not of the enemy, but of information. Another admiral, face tight with anger, pounds 2 fingers on the table at the carrier names, as if accusing the paper itself. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, this is not a defeat. This is a rupture. A younger staff officer, pale, asks the question that is already moving through every mind like ice water. If we have lost the carriers, how do we protect the perimeter? No one answers at first, because the honest answer is that they cannot. Not in the same way. Not for a long time. You can replace steel. You cannot quickly replace flight decks, trained deck crews, veteran pilots, and the muscle memory of a navy that has lived on the offensive. An older officer finally speaks, voice roughened by years of salt air. From this day, we fight a different war. In the same meeting, the decision forms with grim inevitability. The public will not be told. Not now. Not in full. The newspapers will carry stories of brave attacks and glorious spirits. The dead will be listed later, in fragments, drowned in ceremony. In naval circles, though, the truth hits like a physical blow. Men who have spent their lives calculating tonnage and range now calculate time. How many months until new carriers? How many years until new pilots? How long before America brings its full weight across the Pacific? And in that room in Tokyo, under the buzzing lights, the admirals understand something that has nothing to do with ships. Midway is not only a battle lost. It is confidence punctured. It is inevitability reversed. It is the beginning of a national shock that must be delayed, managed, and rationed, because if it arrives all at once, it could crack the home front as surely as bombs crack a flight deck. June 9th, 1942. Tokyo, Navy Ministry. Morning rain turns the courtyard stones dark and slick. Staff cars arrive in steady rhythm, tires hissing on wet gravel. Inside, corridors echo with hurried footsteps that stop the instant a superior appears. Everyone can feel the pressure, even if they do not yet know its shape. In a closed office with the curtains drawn, the Navy Ministry's press liaison officers sit with senior staff. On the table are draft communiques, newspaper clippings, and a list of ship names that will not be spoken in the public. The air is stale, heated by anger and too many cigarettes. One of the senior captains taps the paper where the phrase "temporary loss of contact" has been written, then crossed out, then written again. If we say nothing, rumors will grow. If we say too much, panic will spread. A civilian official from the information apparatus, a man with soft hands and rigid opinions, suggests a phrasing that sounds heroic and meaningless at the same time. A fierce battle. Great damage to the enemy. Our forces withdrew after achieving objectives. An admiral, face like carved wood, looks at him with cold contempt. We did not achieve our objectives. The civilian blinks, startled by the bluntness. In this building, truth is usually wrapped in etiquette. The admiral continues, voice low. But the people must believe we did. That is the paradox that forms in these rooms. The Navy's inner circle knows Midway is a disaster with irreversible strategic consequences. They also know the Empire cannot afford the psychological collapse that might follow if the public learns that 4 fleet carriers have been lost in a single blow. So they begin to build a second operation, not at sea, but in ink. The communique is written like a shield. The enemy is said to have suffered heavily. Japanese pilots are said to have fought with matchless spirit. No mention is made of the carrier decks aflame, of aircraft sliding into the sea, of men trapped below in steel compartments as water rises. The story becomes a controlled fire, not a wildfire. June 10th. The first public statements reach newspapers. In cafes and tram stations, people read headlines that suggest another fierce engagement. They search for the names of victories, for new conquests, for proof that the war continues in the familiar direction. They do not find it, but they also do not find the truth. At naval bases, the atmosphere is different. Sailors and junior officers hear things the public does not. A friend in signals whispers that Akagi is gone. A mechanic from a returning destroyer speaks too freely after drink, describing the horizon glowing like a furnace. A pilot, eyes hollow, refuses to answer questions and only says, "It was hell," before walking away. Rumors creep through barracks like smoke under a door. To stop that smoke, the Navy tightens discipline. On certain ships, returning survivors are warned. Some are ordered. Silence is duty. Details are classified. Letters home are monitored. A man who speaks carelessly might be punished not because he is wrong, but because he is dangerous. In a separate Tokyo office, a list is prepared of the dead and missing. It is not a list meant for families yet. It is a list for planning and for politics. How many pilots? How many carrier deck crews? How many staff officers who knew too much? How many officers whose absence cannot be explained without admitting what happened? The scale creates its own problem. You can hide a single ship loss in a paragraph. You cannot easily hide the disappearance of whole air groups and command staffs. Families will ask. Neighborhood associations will notice. A mother will wonder why her son's unit is suddenly reassigned without explanation. So the Navy begins to stagger the truth. Not all at once. A few names here, a few notices there. A delay blamed on communications. A ship said to have been lost in action without naming where. A funeral with no body. A framed portrait. A shrine offering. Inside naval circles, the language is harsher. In a private discussion, one senior officer uses a phrase that lands heavy, a phrase that is not meant for newspapers. "We have lost the heart of the fleet." Another replies with the bitterness of a man who has watched doctrine collide with reality. "And we lost it without the decisive battle we promised." Midway does not just destroy carriers, it destroys certainty. For years, the Imperial Japanese Navy has believed in a single climactic confrontation where superior spirit, training, and tactical brilliance will overcome an industrial enemy. Now they are forced to confront a new nightmare. The Americans did not need to be lured into a trap. They created their own. In the days following, the admirals begin to argue about causes. These are not debates meant to find truth. They are debates meant to distribute blame in a way that will not fracture the institution. Was it reconnaissance failure? Was it overconfidence? Was it the complexity of the operation? Was it enemy code breaking? An idea some cannot accept because it implies the Japanese were seen and read like an open book. Even the mention of such a possibility is treated carefully, like handling a live shell. Ugaki, back at sea with Yamato, writes, measures, replays the timing. The dive bombers arriving as decks are crowded. The moment the aircraft are being rearmed, the thin margin between order and disaster. In his mind, the battle becomes a sequence of minutes, each one a door that could have opened another way. But the minutes did not open another way. They opened the way they did, and now Japan must walk through the consequences. By mid-June, the Navy's secrecy becomes a wall. Inside, admirals speak of Midway as a turning point, a calamity, an irrecoverable loss of initiative. Outside, the public is offered a myth that must be maintained, because to admit the truth would be to admit that the war is no longer a march forward, but a struggle to hold what has already been taken. In homes across Japan, radios still carry confident voices. Families still bow before shrines and pray for victory. And in the Navy ministry, behind closed doors, men in uniforms stare at maps that suddenly feel too large and at the Pacific that suddenly feels too wide. Late June, 1942. Kure Naval District. Summer heat presses down on the base like a weight, turning metal handrails hot to the touch. In workshops, the smell of paint and welding mixes with the salt air. Men work with the intensity of a nation trying to outrun time. A destroyer slips into harbor under a gray haze. On her deck, a few survivors stand stiffly, uniforms creased, faces thinner than they should be. They are not welcomed by bands or cheering crowds. They are received by officers with clipboards, by military police with watchful eyes, by instructions spoken in tones that admit no questions. You will report for debriefing. You will not speak to anyone outside your unit. Letters will be inspected. The survivors obey. They have learned obedience the hard way. In a conference room away from the docks, senior officers gather to face what Midway means, not as a story, but as mathematics. Charts are laid out. Carrier strength is recalculated. Pilot training pipelines are compared against loss lists. Fuel consumption is weighed against the distances now required to defend a perimeter that suddenly looks exposed. The numbers do not lie, and they do not salute. An admiral points to a column of aircraft carrier decks, once full, now mostly empty. We cannot replace this in a year. Another officer, a specialist in aircrew training, speaks with a bluntness that is almost cruel. We cannot replace the pilots in 2 years, perhaps longer. The men who died were not beginners. A silence follows. It is one thing to lose ships. It is another to lose the men whose hands and instincts made those ships lethal. The battle has also rearranged command relationships. Some officers, eager to protect the Navy's reputation, want to interpret Midway as an accident, a rare convergence of misfortune. Others understand that calling it an accident is a kind of suicide, because it guarantees the same mistakes will return. In Tokyo, meetings become sharper. The Army watches the Navy. The Navy watches the Army, and both watch the political leadership, each fearing that the other will use Midway to win influence. A senior naval staff officer speaks in a room where only trusted ears are present. Our offensive power has been broken. We must conserve what remains. Conserve is a word that tastes wrong in this Navy. The entire identity of the carrier arm has been attack, attack, attack. The idea of conserving feels like admitting weakness. But conserving is exactly what strategy demands now. And strategy is no longer an abstract exercise. It is a fight over decisions that will determine whether Japan can even hold the Solomons, even hold the Central Pacific, even protect the sea lanes that feed the empire. The admirals begin to talk about Guadalcanal before the name becomes famous. They talk about the need to build airfields, to extend patrol zones, to create layers of defense. They talk about shifting from a decisive battle doctrine to an attritional struggle they know, deep down, favors America. In a private moment, an officer says what many are thinking, but few dare to phrase so directly. If America fights for time, time will be on their side. At sea, Yamamoto's staff digests the same reality. Combined fleet is still a powerful force on paper. But paper does not launch aircraft. The carrier force has been the blade. Now the blade is shattered. The battleships are still there. Massive, heavily armored. But a battleship cannot reach out hundreds of miles in an hour the way a carrier air group can. The ocean is too large. The enemy is too fast. Somewhere in those days, within naval circles, Midway stops being described as a single battle and becomes a point on a timeline. Before Midway, after Midway, it is that simple and that brutal. The psychological shock is contained from the public, but among officers, the shock becomes a permanent tremor. Men look at each other differently now. They know that American carrier pilots have proven themselves. They know that American intelligence may have pierced Japanese planning. They know that their own aura of invincibility has evaporated. A training officer at a flight school speaks to instructors, trying to hold discipline while admitting the truth. We can no longer waste lives. We must produce pilots who can survive. Even that sentence reveals the change. Early in the war, survival was secondary to striking the enemy. Now survival becomes strategic. Across Japan's shipyards, steel is cut, plates are riveted, keels are laid. The industrial effort is real, but it is a race against an enemy whose production capacity is larger, whose resources are deeper, whose losses can be replaced with frightening speed. The Admirals know this. They have always known it, at least intellectually. Midway turns the idea into a fact that stares back at them from every chart. In another meeting, a senior officer summarizes the strategic consequence in a single phrase that spreads quietly through the service. We have surrendered the initiative. Surrender is a loaded word. But initiative is what the Navy lived on. Initiative meant choosing where to fight, when to fight, how to fight. It meant controlling the tempo. Midway has handed that tempo to the Americans, and once tempo is lost, every subsequent operation becomes reactive, desperate, conducted under pressure. This is why Midway is immediately recognized in naval circles as irreversible. Not because Japan cannot win any battle afterward, but because the kind of war Japan planned to fight is gone. The clean offensive sweep is gone. The decisive trap is gone. The enemy is not obligated to walk into Japanese guns. Now Japan must guard, must respond, must bleed slowly. And while the public hears nothing but controlled optimism, inside the Navy the officers feel something close to dread. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but steady and practical. The dread of men who have calculated the war and discovered they are on the wrong side of time. July, 1942. Tokyo. The city moves through humid days with the restless rhythm of a nation at war. Streetcars rattle past posters that promise victory. School children practice drills. Housewives queue for rationed goods, trading small complaints and small jokes to make the waiting bearable. And yet something has changed, not in official words, but in the spaces between them. Newspapers still print confident language, but the stories feel strangely thin. Big victories are no longer named with the same certainty. Maps in magazines show wide arrows across the Pacific, but the arrows pause where they used to surge. Radio announcers speak with the same practiced firmness, yet their tone carries an edge of strain, as if they are reciting lines they do not fully believe. People notice without being able to say what they have noticed. In a small neighborhood association meeting, a man mentions that his cousin in the Navy has stopped writing about where he is. Another woman says her neighbor received a notice. Not a death notice, but a vague statement that her husband is missing. Missing in what battle? Missing where? No details, only the stamped seal and the tight, formal phrasing. The room goes quiet, then quickly fills with the rustle of polite denial. He will return. Communications are difficult. The enemy is far away. They say these things because they must. But in naval communities, in ports and base towns, the tension is sharper. Families watch the roads for official cars. They listen for the knock that comes in the afternoon, when the world is bright and ordinary, and becomes suddenly unbearable. The Navy continues to ration the truth. Lists of the dead are not released as a single blow. They appear in fragments, delayed, blended into other announcements, padded with praise. Each notice becomes a small shock that does not explain the larger one. A father receives a letter that is not from his son. It is from an officer he has never met. It praises bravery, loyalty, devotion to the emperor. It explains that the son has fallen in service. It does not say Midway. It does not say carrier. It does not say how. The father bows anyway. His hands shake. He tells himself the words that the state has taught him to say. It was glorious. And then, in the next breath, he wonders why the Navy cannot even tell him where his son died. In the Navy ministry, officials track these reactions like a second front. They receive reports from prefectural offices, from police, from neighborhood associations. They look for signs of wavering morale. They look for rumors and stamp them out. They look for dangerous questions and smother them with ceremony. The phrase that begins to circulate in controlled contexts is that the recent battle was severe but honorable. Severe. A word that can be stretched to cover almost anything. A word that hints without confessing. Among officers, the conversations are more direct, but still cautious. A lieutenant speaks to another in a corridor, voice barely above a breath. "We lost 4. The other man does not ask for what. He already knows. He looks away quickly, as if even hearing it risks punishment. That is how the shock travels. Not as a headline, but as whispers. Not as an explosion, but as aftershocks. Meanwhile, strategic necessity forces the Navy into action that exposes the lie. If Midway had been a victory, why are units reorganizing? Why are air groups being scrambled, reassigned, rebuilt from fragments? Why are older aircraft kept in service? Why are pilots being rushed through training? In flight schools, instructors work longer hours. They push students harder. They cut corners not because they want to, but because the front demands bodies. The veterans who once formed the backbone of training are gone. Some instructors are young men who should be learning themselves. A senior instructor, exhausted, tells a colleague late at night in a hangar smelling of fuel, "We are teaching boys to replace men we cannot replace." His colleague does not answer. There is nothing to say. In naval circles, Midway's impact is discussed with a new kind of honesty, because the consequences are now unavoidable. A staff officer lays out options for future operations, and each option is worse than the last. They can commit their remaining carrier strength and risk annihilation. They can avoid major engagements and concede territory. They can attempt to lure the Americans into another trap, but now they must assume the enemy sees through traps. One admiral speaks in private with bitterness. The Americans have learned. We have taught them. It is a harsh admission, but it is also true. Midway has revealed not only Japanese vulnerabilities, but American capability. The enemy is no longer an opponent to be dismissed as soft. The enemy is aggressive, creative, and willing to gamble. In mid-July, the official line remains controlled. The public is not told that Midway has shifted the war's balance, but the state cannot erase reality forever. And so it begins preparing the population psychologically, slowly, with new themes. Endurance, sacrifice, long struggle. Words that would have sounded unnecessary in December now become central. The home front hears these words and does not fully understand why they are suddenly so important. But people are not fools. They sense the gap between promise and necessity. In a quiet moment, a man on a train folds his newspaper and stares at the window reflection of his own face. He thinks of the war as something far away, beyond the horizon. But now he feels it as a pressure in the chest, as if the ocean itself has crept closer. The national shock is still withheld, but it is no longer fully contained. It leaks through absence, through rationing, through the nervous tightening of official language, and among the admirals. The shock has already hardened into a grim understanding. Midway is not merely a secret. It is a wound that will shape every decision from this point forward, whether the public is allowed to name it or not. August 1942. A warm night settles over Japan like a blanket that cannot soothe. Cicadas grind out their relentless song in parks and temple grounds. In a small house, a radio glows softly. The family gathered close to hear the evening broadcast. The announcer's voice is steady. formal, practiced. He speaks of fierce fighting in the southern seas. He speaks of the courage of sailors and pilots. He speaks of the sacred duty to endure. He does not speak of Midway, but by now the war itself is speaking in its own language. A new battle has begun in the Solomon Islands. Ships are sunk. Aircraft fall from the sky. Names of places that used to be unknown appear more often. And each time they appear, the tone is heavier. The home front begins to feel the grind. This is where Midway's national shock becomes inevitable. Not because the Navy Ministry suddenly chooses honesty, but because events on the map start to demand an explanation. The public senses that the war is not unfolding like the early months. There are fewer triumphs. There is more sacrifice asked. There is more emphasis on spirit because material certainty has weakened. And inside the Navy, the admirals speak with the grim clarity of men who have stopped pretending to themselves. In a staff room near the Naval General Staff, a senior officer points to new American carrier activity. He traces lines with a ruler, showing where enemy strikes might fall, where Japanese convoys might be intercepted. The officer's finger stops and presses hard on the map as if pinning down a moving target. They have the initiative. They can choose the time and place. A younger commander asks the question that feels like a confession. Can we regain it? The older officer answers without anger, without drama, not quickly, perhaps not at all. That is the irreversible consequence the admirals recognized at once. Midway was not just ships lost. It was the loss of operational freedom, the ability to set the tempo, to dictate the rhythm, to decide the moment of engagement. Without that, every plan becomes a response. Every response comes late. And with each late response, the public's faith, carefully managed, begins to crack. The Navy continues its controlled storytelling, but now it has to reconcile the myth with a new reality. Notices of death increase. Missing in action becomes a phrase families learn to fear. The staggered lists grow longer. The patriotic ceremonies multiply, as if ritual can patch what the truth would tear open. In base towns, people start to whisper the name Midway more openly. Not from newspapers, but from sailors on leave, from cousins who heard something in a canteen, from a neighbor who saw an officer carrying a stack of condolence letters. The name travels with a shiver, as if speaking it might summon consequences. It is not just the loss that shocks people when it finally seeps through. It is the sudden understanding that the state did not trust them with the truth. That realization changes the flavor of patriotism. Devotion remains, but it becomes more strained, more brittle, more complicated. When victory is certain, belief is easy. When victory becomes endurance, belief becomes labor. In one home, a mother kneels before a small shrine, hands pressed together, eyes closed. She prays for her missing son, but the prayer is no longer pure hope. It is mixed with questions she cannot ask aloud. Where did he die? Why was I not told? What else is being hidden? Inside the Navy, the admirals are forced to confront the cost of secrecy. Withholding news buys time, but it also builds pressure. When pressure is released, it can release trust along with it. The Navy's leaders understand this, but they also understand that they had little choice. A sudden admission of Midway in June could have been catastrophic for morale at the very moment Japan needed unity, so they chose a slower poisoning instead of a single blow. In private, one officer admits what the public cannot hear. We fought the battle at sea. Then we fought a battle against despair at home. And still, despair keeps finding cracks. As the months pass, Japan's strategic situation tightens. Convoys are attacked. Fuel becomes precious. The Navy begins to husband resources, to avoid risks it once embraced. Those choices ripple outward. The public experiences them as shortages, as longer lines, as more stringent rationing. They experience them as the war coming closer. Not in bombs yet, but in the narrowing of daily life. That narrowing is Midway's shadow on the home front. By the time the national consciousness truly absorbs the scale of Midway, the shock is not a single moment. It is an accumulation, a realization layered over months of hints, absences, and careful language. It arrives in the way people look at official statements, in the way conversations drop suddenly when someone in uniform enters a room, in the way confidence is replaced by determination that has to be forced. And among the admirals, there is no longer any debate about what Midway was. It was the hinge of the war. It was the day the Empire's offensive power was cut. It was the day the enemy proved not only that it could survive, but that it could strike back harder than Japan imagined. It was the day Japan began fighting not for sweeping victory, but for times, for position, for survival. In the darkened command rooms, in the quiet voices of men who know the sea and its brutal honesty, the essence of what they said, what they meant, is simple. Midway was a disaster, and disasters do not end when the flames go out. They end when the world that existed before them is gone.